Well, hey everybody, thanks for joining us for another week of our review of our reading plan through the life of Moses, along with our sermon series called A Man After God's Own Glory. This week, as you can see if you're watching the video, I'm joined by Travis Rieger. But Travis made the mistake of letting me know he had a couple days off work this week, so he is here helping me record this week. You don't know this if you're watching at home, but I'm going to tell you this is our second attempt at this because our tech department, which is me, made some mistakes on the first recording. So hopefully this is the one that you're actually getting to watch and or listen to. But at least part of the reason that I wanted Travis to be here is because Travis and his family have been going through this reading plan together, which I hope you have as well. But what you don't know, or what I hope you haven't done, is that Travis actually got confused, and I think that's a fair word.
Yeah.
And his family got a week ahead on the reading plan, and so last week Travis sent me a message and said, hey, we were doing our reading plan for today, and I had a question about this thing in Exodus chapter 7, and I was like, well, you're in the wrong week of the reading plan, Travis, but it's a good question. And now that we are in that week in the reading plan, I thought, it's not your misery, that's not the word I want to use, but
No.
Travis's mistake Travis's blunder becomes your benefit if you are watching and or listening to this. So let's start there, Travis. You and Lisa have been reading through our reading plan each day with your kids, and you've got thoughtful kids, and so they've had questions for you, and so you and I are going to try to answer them together maybe, and hopefully it can be a benefit to the people watching and listening here. So let's start there. What have you guys found reading through this section of Exodus together?
Well, I think first of all, we found that when it says week of, that means it's the week beginning of. Yeah.
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 So, it means what it says it means. Yeah,
it
that's
means
true.
what it says it means. If everything meant what it said it meant, that'd be great. And it means what it says it means. So we got back on track. But, we've been enjoying reading through this and hearing the kids' reactions, because we don't press them too hard, but it's just a quick, what was your reaction? What stood out to you? What makes you curious? What questions might you have? And they've asked some good questions, and we've had some good chuckles about how many frogs really were there, or, what did the snakes look like when the staffs turned to snakes. But we can start around there. In preparation to read through this or discuss this with Monty, I went back and looked at one of my old commentaries and from Bible college, and the author of the commentary really went out to clarify that we often call this the 10 plagues, 10 miracles, 10 wonders. But the commentary writer really wanted to point out that we often forget to consider the miracle of God turning the staff into a snake, and that's where I'd like to begin. Is that imagery there where Aaron throws the staff down and God turns it into a snake, but the magicians of Pharaoh are able to do the same thing. But this beautiful detail where Aaron's staff, snake, was able to consume the others, and that's such a foreshadowing of what's about to come and where we're going to ultimately end up in the reading.
Yeah, that things kind of begin there, and I think it's, even as you were talking, I was looking at Exodus 7:12. It says, the end of verse 12, Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. It's like, well, if you just read that verse, it's confusing. If we lose the detail that it's actually a snake, but it is a staff. Anyway, but there's that foreshadowing there, exactly like you're talking about. Moses and Aaron come before Pharaoh. They're able to do this miracle, but Pharaoh's wise men and sorcerers, his magicians, are able to do the same thing. And verse 11 says, by their secret arts. And we see that happen through the first few plagues. And there's maybe an element there of, well, Moses and Aaron must not be that special because these magicians are able to do this as well. And of course, that begs the question for us of what's actually going on here. How are they able to do this? The text just says secret arts. Is that something, that seems like something evil, demonic, something like that? The text doesn't really explain it to us. Something there that even if they're able to replicate this in some way, their ability to do the same thing that Aaron is doing here is apparently not as impressive because Moses' snake wins the battle royale here, or whatever we want to call it.
Snake fighting. Illegal snake fighting.
Yeah, the snake fighting ring going on in Pharaoh's palace here. I don't know. And even that is giving us a little bit of a foreshadowing of how this is going to play out as we get into these actual plagues that aren't just visible to Pharaoh and his closest advisors, but the nation as a whole. Mm-hmm. And we get into that first one with the plague of the Nile River turning into blood. And you had some things that your family noticed as you guys were reading through that.
It's not uncommon for our conversations to end in, discussion of bodily fluids and whatnot, So blood comes up every once in a while, and to have this imagery really written beautifully here, talking about how everything was turned into blood, even the water that was stored in jars or wooden buckets or whatever, like that is extreme. Because if you're a skeptic, you might be able to say, well, there could be this and these streams could flow into here.
This thing got in the water, yeah.
But to turn these jars, even the water in there, into blood is really profound. That's very powerful. And in this same, the Pharaoh's Pharaoh's magicians were able to replicate.
They were Egyptian.
Magicians. There's a tongue twister in there if you say it 7 times fast. They were able to replicate part of that and turn some water into blood. And so one of the things that the kids asked was like, where in the world did they get clean water to try to replicate what God did?
Yeah, and I don't know if the text gives us a clear answer. Maybe it's, speculating, but, maybe it's hopefully not in an unhelpful way that, that it's kind of a slow spreading thing, so they go get some water that hasn't turned to blood yet and they can replicate it. I don't really know. Like we said already, the text just tells us they are able to do it by their secret arts. Secret arts. It sounds like I said it wrong, but anyway. And yet through all of that, that and maybe some more things going on there allows Pharaoh to harden his heart. We're looking, if you got a Bible open as you're watching or listening to this, we're right at the end of Exodus chapter 7, that the magicians are able to do these things. They're able to also turn water into blood, and Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said he would, that he decides for whatever reason, he doesn't need to listen to Moses and Aaron, and he hardens his heart against what they're telling him to do. And so he turns around, he goes off into the palace. He doesn't take this to heart, and there's almost, I don't know if you can picture this like a movie. I don't know, it's like the camera's on Pharaoh, and he shrugs his shoulders and goes back into the palace. Mm-hmm. And as he does that, the camera pans out, and verse 24 says that the Egyptians are digging along the Nile River to get drinking water because they could not drink the water of the river. Pharaoh's unimpressed, and he goes back into the palace, but there's desperation, even with this first plague from the people, that, we got to find water, we got to live. And you might know, even in the nation of Egypt today, the Nile River is life. If something goes wrong in the Nile River, if its level goes down or whatever, it makes for desperate times pretty quickly. And you see the people in Egypt dealing with that fact right here at the beginning with the first plague. But Pharaoh hardens his heart. He doesn't go along with Moses and Aaron's request. He decides to go back into the palace and turns a blind eye to what is happening around him.
And he doesn't just turn his back on the works of God, the miracle of God, but he turns his back on his own people. And I think that speaks volumes to how hard Pharaoh's heart really is, and how hardened it is. Yeah,
and we'll see that continue throughout this, and kind of this back and forth throughout this, where Pharaoh hardens his heart, but then God hardens it as well as things progress. Here with the first few plagues, it's Pharaoh looking at the situation and deciding to reject what Moses and Aaron are saying and requesting and hardening his heart. But as things continue to progress, God starts to get involved and hardens his heart as well. And I think that's one of the things we notice throughout this section of the plagues, that as things continue to progress, there's a narrowing and an intensification happening. That at the beginning, it's the magicians are able to replicate it, and it's not that big a deal, and Pharaoh ignores it and goes about his way. But as things continue, the magicians aren't able to replicate it. As things continue, the plagues get more and more intense, and Pharaoh continues to harden his heart. The plagues start to affect just the Egyptians, not everyone. The Israelites are spared from some of these plagues, and so you have the notes continue to get louder and louder as things go along throughout this, and there seems to be this progression going on of just what God is doing and how He's bringing it about to make all this happen, so that Pharaoh will eventually release the Israelites out of slavery. First maybe we should trace this notion of Pharaoh hardening his heart and then God hardening his heart as well. What do we make of that, or what is worth noticing from that as we read through this in your mind, Travis?
I think about, like, this might not be the right word even, but there's some entitlement, I think, in that. Like, I think Pharaoh, in this time period, it was Egyptian belief that their leaders were part God or God themselves. And so there is this stubborn entitlement that Pharaoh might have, like, how dare these Israelites try to defy what I'm doing? Don't they know who I am? Yeah. And there's God there saying, no. You need to know who I am.
Yeah.
And there's this Pharaoh's hardening his own heart. But back in last week's reading, God even says out to Moses, like, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart because they need to see the miraculous signs that I can do. They need to see how powerful I am, because Pharaoh's only seen a small taste of how powerful God is, and he's still like, whatever.
Yeah.
No big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, and even go, like you said, go back to last week when Moses and Aaron first come before Pharaoh. They say, the Lord says you should release my people and let them go into the wilderness. And Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? And like you're saying, in the world of the Egyptians, Pharaoh is a god. They have all these other gods they worship. Egypt's the most powerful nation in the world. Pharaoh says, like, I'm not really impressed with the God of the Israelites. I don't really care to know who he is. And then the irony is that, well, over the course of 10 plagues, you're going to learn exactly who the God of Israel is and the power that he has and what he is doing in the world. And I think that's worth pointing out, just like you were saying, that throughout these plagues and in a lot of places throughout the Old Testament, God will make the statement that I'm going to do this miraculous thing. I'm going to do whatever it is. And once that happens, then you will know that I am the Lord. Yeah. There's this repetition that it's not just for the sake of, God's not just sending plagues for the sake of sending plagues or whatever it might be. He's doing this to reveal who he is. I think you mentioned earlier when we were talking about this, even going back to God first calling Moses in Exodus chapter 3, Moses asks, he seems to have an incomplete understanding of who God is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that this is not, I've heard about this God, but I don't know who he is. And I grew up in Egypt where there's all these gods and everyone worships all of them and there's all these different things. And so there's an element through this of God making known to his own people and to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh exactly who he is. And that takes a little bit of a what might seem like a strange path to us, because you would think surely there's more efficient ways to do this than 10 plagues or whatever it might be. But there's this steady progression through all of these plagues of just making known who he is, making his power known, and all of these things.
Making himself known to not just the Egyptians and Pharaoh, but to the Israelites as well. Yeah. As it does seem like, God seems to give Moses his resume at the first part. Yeah. I was Abraham. I delivered Abraham. I delivered, and Moses repeats that many times in last week's reading.
Yeah, you don't need to read this entire section of Scripture. Hopefully you're reading it if you're following along with us, but maybe we could just notice a couple things from this. This building more and more into a showdown between the God of Israel and Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. You maybe heard that before, but we start to notice that pretty early in the plague of the gnats. So this would be the third of the plagues. This is one where the magicians are not able to replicate this miracle for the first time, and so the magicians say in Exodus 8:19, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. We see that little bit of a progression that the magicians, at least, are, for whatever reason, they say we can't do this. We can't do this miracle like we did the first two. So there's something going on here, and yet Pharaoh doesn't seem to want to go along with it, to acknowledge the reality of the situation, and he hardens his heart, and doesn't listen to what his own advisors are saying, just like God had predicted.
I think one of the things that stands out to me, even before it's verse 25 of chapter 7, and 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. So before the plague of frogs came, before Moses came to Pharaoh again, 7 days had passed, and I think about this hardening of your heart. And we can be guilty of our hearts being hardened when there's unresolved things going on with us that we haven't, brought somebody in on or sought out forgiveness or reconciliation. And for 7 days, Pharaoh's heart continued to harden.
Yeah.
And even maybe fester. That's a great word.
Yeah.
Before there were more frogs, and even there's a slight glimmer of hope, I think, in some of this, where Pharaoh sees all these frogs everywhere.
Yeah.
And he tells Moses, go pray to your God and ask him to take these frogs away. So there's a small sliver of Pharaoh that believes that Moses' God, Yahweh, is powerful.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. There's this back and forth, this tension that I think to a certain extent is in all of us. None of us are Pharaoh, but we've all been like Pharaoh at some point, Pharaoh thinks he's in charge. He like you said there in 8:8, he says, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me, and I will let your people go." And so that happens. Jumping down to verse 12, Moses cries out to the Lord. The frogs die, and they die everywhere, in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. That's a verse of the Bible that I'm glad we don't have, smell-o-vision for, because yikes. And then verse 15, when Pharaoh sees that there's relief, he hardens his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, again, just as the Lord said. The plague of gnats come, like we just talked about. We go to the plague of flies, the fourth one. And again, like you're saying, there's a little bit of softening, maybe we might think, from Pharaoh. There in verse 25, he tries to negotiate, I think might be the right word there. He says, "Go sacrifice to your God here in the land." He says, let's try to barter here a little bit. You guys can do what you want to do, but just don't leave Egypt. Stay here, and hence, stay in slavery. And yet Moses refuses to enter into these negotiations. I guess we could put it that way. And yet things resolve, similar to what you're saying. The plague of flies ends, but the last verse of Exodus 8, Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. And so then we and we'll get into this on Sunday a little bit too. There's these at least the first 9 plagues kind of work in these cycles of 3. And so that ends the first cycle of plagues. We start the second cycle where things begin to get a little more intense. And so the next plague is the one of the livestock, and therein all of the Egyptians' livestock dies, but none of the Israelites does. And I think it's so interesting in Exodus 9:7, excuse me. Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died, yet his heart was unyielding and he would not let the people go. Like Pharaoh's not unaware of what's going on here. He looks around, he says, well, all the Egyptian livestock's died, none of the Israelite livestock has died, yet he refuses to do what Moses has said. This
plague of the livestock really is the first one that God delivers the Israelites from. Yeah. And I mean that fits into nicely where you referenced the different cycles. The second cycle begins as God now is protecting the Israelites, and that was something in the plague of the livestock and the boils and the thunder and hail that stood out to my family, is how God really had his hand over the Israelites and protected them from this.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously that culminates with the last plague, the plague of the firstborn and the meal of the Passover and all of that we'll get into next week. But you do see that here of God providing relief for his people, and they still have to deal with the consequences of these plagues to some extent, but not as intensely as Pharaoh and the Egyptians experience. But things continue. We get the plague of boils, where at that point, we haven't heard about the Pharaoh's magicians in a little bit, but then they show up here. Well, they get mentioned because they're in 9:11. They could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them. So not only can they not replicate this anymore, but it's so intense they can't even, can they just? We're not really told. They're hurting so bad they can't get out of bed, or something's going on here. They can't stand in Moses' presence. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say my brain is goes to that word stand, and I'd be curious to do a little word study on what that word means, because was it they physically were unable to stand, or they couldn't bring themselves to be in Moses' presence?
Yeah, or is it almost like they're unclean and so they can't be out in public or something like that too? I don't know. I would have to dig into it too. But yeah, it could be something like that too. And you get this, on that note of God's provision, I'm looking ahead to the next plague of hail. There's a warning ahead of time for the plague of hail. And verse 18, this time tomorrow I'll send the worst hailstorm that's ever fallen on Egypt. Give an order now so that everyone can get their livestock inside. I'm paraphrasing. Some people listen and some don't. And this hailstorm comes, and Pharaoh admits that he's done wrong. He says in verse 27, this time I've sinned, the Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord that all this would stop. And, we're told that a couple crops are wiped out. And then Moses left Pharaoh. The plague ends. Pharaoh sees in verse 34, the rain and hail have stopped. And so he sinned again, and he and his officials hardened their hearts. And so we just continue to see this progression. And it reaches the point, I believe, is it in the next plague, in the plague of locusts, where at the end of the plague of locusts in verse 20, that in Exodus 10:20, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. I think that's worth noticing, because when we hear this language of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, it can almost sound to us like God's taken a good person and made them evil. But really, when you read throughout this narrative, there's this back and forth between Pharaoh rejecting what God has said, and then God allowing him to remain in that. I think is probably the right language, or at least is how I would want to say it. That Pharaoh has told God, I don't want to follow your agenda. I don't want to go along with what you want for your people. And so God hands him over to the consequences of that. Ultimately, like we were saying, I think we were just saying this, so that God can make himself known, and can reveal his glory to the Israelites and the Egyptians.
Everyone. There's just this lack of repentance from Pharaoh, and even in the midst of God delivering him too, as he tells Moses, go pray to your God, go pray to the Lord to ease us from these things. Moses does this multiple times, and Pharaoh still is like, well, I'm not going to let the Israelites go anymore. I changed my mind. Yeah. There's that sinning against them, and him seeing the wonders of God, him seeing God deliver even himself, but not recognizing it, and not repenting.
Yeah, and so, like we mentioned earlier, he negotiates. At first he's like, well, you guys can offer your sacrifices, but don't leave Egypt. Or he'll say, well, you can go, but only the men can go, and leave the women and children here. Or the people can go, but leave the livestock here. And there's all, leave a little security deposit or something so that you'll come back. And I think there's a little bit of irony there that, Pharaoh keeps assuming that he has power in the situation, and he just doesn't. And he doesn't recognize that fact, that God is showing that he's the one true God, that he rules over all things, that he has all this power, and Pharaoh keeps trying to have it not even have it both ways, have it his way.
Yeah.
Because that's how things tend to go. And God is teaching him, he's teaching all the Egyptians, he's teaching his own people that no, there's something else going on here, that there's one true God, and he rules over all things. I mean, when you read through these 10 plagues, it touches all of nature, every level of society.
Yeah.
As God's making it known who he is to anyone who will pay attention.
It's up until this point, before Friday's reading of Exodus 10, where one of the things that stood out to Jax, my middle guy, is that he asked, well, don't you think the Egyptians were exhausted by this and wanted Pharaoh to like just let the Israelites go? And we get a little snapshot of this in Exodus 10 verse 7, where Pharaoh's officials are even going to him and asking Pharaoh, how long shall this fellow be a snare to us? Let the people go so they may worship their Lord, their God. And then they even say, do you not understand that Egypt is ruined?
Yeah.
Like Pharaoh's blinded by his hardened heart.
Yeah.
So much so to the point that he doesn't maybe even notice how destructive things have been.
Yeah. Everyone around him is saying, like, we've lost. Like, cut your losses and move, cut bait and move on, whatever it might be. Yeah. And Pharaoh is so entrenched against what God has said that he, I think blinded is a good word, or another way of describing that hardened heart, that he's so against what God has said that he can't even see reality at this point. And maybe that is, ironically, leads us into that ninth plague of darkness, that Pharaoh can't see what's going on, so God just takes away the light from Israel or from Egypt. The Israelites still have light for these 3 days, but it's an intense darkness. You would notice in verse 21 that there is darkness that can be felt, and it's so intense. In verse 23, no one moves about for 3 days. I don't know how this works, but it is such intense darkness that it's more than just it's a cloudy few days in the forecast. People are just sitting at home because they're terrified of how dark it is. And yet, at the end of that, we're told that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. He was not willing to let the people go. He says, I think it's maybe a little ironic again. He says to Moses in 10:28, get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die. The next time you and I see each other, Moses, it'll be the last thing you ever do. And then ironically, we go straight into God saying, well, now I'm going to send a plague where the firstborn in all of Egypt is going to die, unless they're covered with the blood of the Passover lamb. Throughout all of this, Pharaoh does not have the power that he thinks he has. And yet we can also acknowledge that maybe this is a little intense from God. Like we said, he touches all of nature, all of society. There is suffering that comes from God pouring out his judgment here. And so we might hesitate when we read this at times of saying that God's loving, God's great, he's gracious to his people. Yet he also pours out his wrath here on Egypt. What do we have to say about that, if anything?
I mean, how much more do we? Well, like God came to Moses and told him, "Tell Pharaoh to let my people go." And this started from a non-violent, non-destructive path, and Pharaoh really intensified it and upped the ante. And I think in our first take, I mentioned too that I once heard either from Monte or in a podcast, I'm not sure which one, probably from Monte because
I'll take
super
credit.
Wise.
Yeah.
that God doesn't promise us that we'll live a life that's pain-free, but he does promise to bring purpose to it. And even in all of this destruction, there's purpose to it. And there's things happening, stirring because of it, just not stirring in Pharaoh.
Yeah, and like we've already mentioned, kind of through all of this, it's God making himself known. That's the purpose behind all of this. And it's also that he's pouring out his judgment on sin. I think a lot of times when we hesitate about God being just, we're not taking sin seriously. But But, we learn later, Isaac and I talked about this last week, that this is 4 centuries of Israel being in Egypt. This is a long time of Israel being in slavery purely because Pharaoh was trying to keep them from becoming too powerful. And so God is not just raining down, hail from heaven because he's in a bad mood or anything like that. He's dealing with the injustice of his people being in slavery for centuries. And he's showing that, if nothing else, that's not okay. That it's not okay to treat another human being like property, and that he has something to say about that, that he stands up for the downtrodden and the suffering, and he takes down the powerful so that they might know who God is, that any power they have has just been given to them by God. And we see these notes in here that there's some recognition of that from the people. God makes the comment a couple different times that when all this shakes out, that Israel's going to plunder the Egyptians. It's like Israel's going to conquer the nation of Egypt without having to lift a finger, because God's going to do all the work. And, at the beginning of chapter 11, God says that when you leave Egypt, the men and women are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. That happens in chapter 12 when Israel leaves. And we're told in the midst of this in verse 38 that many other people went up with them. It's not just, this isn't just about Egypt versus Israel. It is about who wants to recognize that there's one true God in the world and who does not. That God's inviting anyone that wants to be a part of it into this covenant that he's making. And that's a thread we see especially come out in the New Testament, but it's running all the way through the story of Scripture, that God is not just picking out one specific group of people, one specific family or anything like that. He's working through that family and anyone that wants to come be a part of that family so that his glory can be made known to the world and his blessings can be poured out.
God really, this golden thread, this one line that comes through the whole Scripture, that God is seeking out these people, seeking us out. And it's ironic that in the New Testament the Pharisees miss this too, and as they're such devout Jews at the time, and they miss this, that the Gentiles can be part of this too. From the beginning, God is calling us all to him. Not just one family group, not just one lineage, but everyone. It strikes me too as this is the call for us still. This is the call for everyone still. It's not just from the New Testament. It's not just from the Old Testament. It continues throughout time. God calling us all to be in community. He be his people.
And Genesis 12, God says, Abraham, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to, through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. That's right at the beginning of God establishing this covenant with his people. And then, you move forward, here in a story like this in the book of Exodus, well, I should say at the end of the book of Genesis, Jacob adopts his 2 grandsons that are the sons of Joseph. And, sure, they are half Israelite, but they're also half Egyptian. And so right here from the beginning, this is obviously not just about having the right ethnicity. And then you get to the Exodus, and apparently there are people in Egypt who can't trace their family line back to Abraham, but they see what God is doing, and they say, I want to be a part of that. And you get to the book of Joshua, and in the city of Jericho, Rahab says, I've heard about what your God has done to Egypt. I'm abandoning my people. I'm going with you. You get that. You get to the story of Ruth. Ruth is from Moab, but she becomes a part of God's people. She becomes a part of David's family line. You get to Isaiah, and Isaiah says there's going to be a day where all the nations of the world are coming to Jerusalem to worship God. You get all these things. And so maybe it makes sense why Jesus gets so offended in the temple and says, my house is supposed to be a prayer for all the nations. And then it makes sense that, when Jesus gets to the end of the Gospel of Matthew and he says, go into all the world and make disciples. It's this same thread, exactly like what you're saying, that God is calling us into, calling us all people, anyone that wants to be a part of it, into this covenant he's established with his people. And we get to share in that glory and in that blessing.
I think, too, there's so much value in in our community diving into this together.
Yeah.
And I mean, we might all be doing this kind of on islands with our own families or whatever, but there's something beautiful that happens when we read Scripture together, when we dive into it together. And,
there are always things that other people notice that we don't, and vice versa. And there's always things, no matter how many times we read Scripture, really, if nothing else, just because it's a big book, we miss things, or we read things, we think, oh, I forgot about that, or I thought this, but it's actually this, or whatever it might be. So whoever you are, however familiar you are with the book of Exodus, with the life of Moses, hopefully this could be an encouragement to you to dive in, because there might be things you haven't noticed before, and do that alongside other people, because they might see things that you don't, and you might see things that they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right on. Be an encouragement. Well, Travis, I'm glad that I'm glad your family has been encouraged and blessed by this. Hopefully that could be an encouragement to other people as well. Hopefully this recording works. And hopefully we don't have to do this a third time. And whoever you are, may you read and be blessed by it as we see how God and His glory is revealed through Moses and the Israelites, and may we pursue that glory as well. So enjoy your reading. Hope this was a blessing for you, and we'll see you on Sunday, where we walk through the plagues of the book of Exodus.
Mm-hmm.